not do a very typical like researchy kind of presentation here, so don't panic. I'm going to try and take this now as a very gentle way to just wrap up today's first session of this Thicket Forum this year, because I think you've probably noticed how the language that we use to speak about the value of Thicket, how we feel about Thicket, how we manage Thicket is starting to change. Like words already today, people have mentioned being regenerative instead of just saying sustainability, people saying upliftment, thriving, and now a session about eco grief. And also, interesting how our language, even around the financial value of Thicket, is becoming a lot more sophisticated. We learned a lot of new terms this morning as well, or pretend we understand them. So today I'm going to just talk a little bit more about that aspect of also how it's changing how people are in practice and in literature starting to change, talking about how we speak about or frame the stewardship of our ecosystems, and in this case now specifically the thicket. Okay, so just to take you back a little bit, last year during the thicket we did a little bit of an interactive session around different ways that we value thicket. Just as this thicket community, like when we say the natural capital thicket, what are the kind of things that come up when we say social capital, financial capital, and also that more like personal inspiration that we get from thicket. Now, this was roughly based on Commonland's 4 returns framework, but this is just a pin to keep in mind for tomorrow when that's actually going to be the whole presentation around that. But just to give context. So, from this is just going to be a very quick summary of reminder of how the Thicketiers from last year at least expressed the value for Thicket. Now, of course, when it came to natural capital, there was a lot of talk about, ecosystem services. That was kind of like the major theme and value coming out. But there was also a lot of questions about what do we mean with restoration. And we've already had a few presentations today also that questions this idea of, are we talking about restoration or rehabilitation? What does it mean in practice? What does it mean for different people? And of course, that is linked to different incentives for rehabilitating or supporting these ecosystem services, sources of livelihood, especially employment. And then we also spoke about environmental education, also in terms again about looking at other kind of opportunities for people to have livelihoods tied to thicket that may just not be a direct resource use, but also through education or similar activities. And we spoke about a lot about principles for not only that we should collaborate, but how do we collaborate with each other? Are we doing this in secretive ways, or are we doing this authentically, informal ways? And then, of course, we spoke about different values that people have for thicket, maybe medicinal plants, maybe cultural values, production values, all of those. And then we also spoke about how could we inspire stewardship for thicket? And here things came up a little bit of, I think someone actually said that Thicket almost has a marketing problem or a branding problem. For some reason, it's difficult to get people really excited about Thicket because people look at it, it's like, oh, it's just lump sum plants. What am I going to do if it's not as charismatic as Fynbos, for example? You can't take these epic landscape photos as the grasslands or savannas. And there was also then, some people made then suggestions of, okay, should we start telling stories about Thicket? Or have cultural festivals around Thicket, or these kind of promotional things. So today I'm going to delve a little bit into this idea of relational values, which is a way to look at the value of natural resources or nature in general, more from this inspirational stewardship perspective, just to unpack a little bit what that means. But it also ties to the more personal space, because the relational values in part speak to what it is. It's part of what that feeling of loss is when we lose a natural environment that we are attached to, when we see the degradation. It's these relational values that we lose. It's also these relational values that are almost like this deeper meaning and value that we gain from restoring natural areas. And when we involve people from that beyond just material income or outcomes. So very quickly, what relational values means is that it's a different way of looking how we're valuing nature. Now, very typically, and you've probably seen these kind of words used before, people talk about intrinsic value, meaning that an aspect of nature, a species, a plant, or a landscape has a value beyond any direct tie to a human need or sense of a value. And it's very typically also seen from, you can say, this is now a very pure conservation kind of perspective. We conserve the species just because it's there, just because it has a right to be there by its own, not because it has some kind of real actual value of anything for us. At least this is how it's framed typically. Then you've of course got instrumental value, which is now your typical economic, material, food, energy kind of way of value. And then you've got this new idea of value, which is coming up. When I say new, it's actually tied to more traditional ways of looking at it, but new way of framing it, which ties more to this idea of cultural identity, sense of belonging, sense of place. So people sometimes frame it as ways of well-being in terms of having a sense of meaning in life, living the good life, all of these kind of things. And it's really in rural communities and what people call indigenous communities, these kind of people who don't necessarily live in urban areas. These are the kind of ways they express the value of nature. But of course, that's a very generalized sense of looking at it. But this is just to give you an idea of how we're starting to try and differentiate between these different values and realizing there's something else here that's a little bit more emergent and complex than just simply material value and intrinsic value. And this is just another way of framing it, that it's a lot more involved with both the practices of care between you and the natural environment. Now, this is now just an example of a farmer and his livestock. Now, if you work with most, I would say, in general, with a livestock farmer, you know they don't just care about the animals because it's a source of income. It's a different kind of relationship. It's a very deep connection there of caring for something. So it's in an emotional space, it's an ethics space, it's to do with practice, it's a source of joy and sorrow, as we've also spoken, as Emma mentioned. So the idea here is that to recognize that when you're engaging with people from stewardship, it comes from this kind of value space, these kind of relational values and the sense of care. So again, with stewardship, framing it as not just looking after resources for the next generation, it's this actually, they call it evolving, unfolding, constant relationship that you have with the natural environment, with your landscape. Which also means that it doesn't always fit as nicely into a linear project time frame or clear outcomes and these kind of things. It's not something to be achieved or an outcome. It's this constant emerging value that you need to keep on working on over time. And it changes also over time as relationships do. So why is it important? Well, there's some, of course, indications that people being involved in conservation have several kind of outcomes for their mental health and general well-being. These are some examples that people say have reported, and there's scientific evidence for this. People report, some benefits of conservation, like being outside, making a difference, being in a group, physical activity, gaining having a sense of personal achievement, which then also leads to a lot of physical, social, cognitive, and emotional benefits. So I'm not going to go into detail, just to show you that there are actually these links. So the good feelings that we get when we do conservation, it doesn't come out of nowhere. It is a real, very real thing, and there's real science behind this. I do want to highlight here that I found it interesting in this handbook. They didn't actually connect any evidence between conservation and personal growth and having fun. And yet in my own anecdotal experiences in working in conservation, that is actually something that I've experienced in my own teams, I experience with when I'm working with communities. Just to highlight that there may be even more deeper values that we get from this, besides just the very neat and clear outcomes of how many hectares we've restored. all of these things are happening as well in ourselves and in the teams and the people we work with. And what this means now, I'm just taking it a little bit now to the South African context. What do all these nice words mean and theories and ideas for South African context? Now, as all of you know, in South Africa, we live and work with quite contested landscapes, meaning that it's a difficult history, it's a difficult current context. There's a lot of calls for trade-offs, different values, different needs, and sometimes very antagonistic different groups of people who you want to work with, but they can't really work together. It can be a mess. And a lot of that comes from this idea of non-places, or at least a lot of our landscapes are moving into a direction of becoming a non-place, meaning that people are losing connection to the land, either because of historical reasons or now for contemporary reasons that the land just can't provide for them a livelihood anymore, or becomes too unsafe to live there. And people move and then lose connection to that history, lose connection maybe to their family ties. You can think about all the farmers that are basically selling their land now, even though they've had that land for generations, because it's just not economically viable anymore. So we almost have these historical, social, economic relationships of land starting to break up in our context. And that's why this idea of looking at stewardship as a bounding object, you can say, which draws on not just ideas of getting people to collaborate to work around a natural resource, but it actually involves, of course, knowledge and different forms of knowledge. For example, today we spoke a lot of ecological knowledge, but also this almost like emotional intelligence and knowledge, social knowledge, and then economic knowledge, but also a sense of agency for people, working with it, and with this idea of linking it to care, which is really at the base of people's motivation to get involved in stewardship, and then also ethics. So this is just an example of one study in South Africa that I could find in Renosterveld, which actually looked at several different landowners participating in Renosterveld conservation and identified in this study, in this specific landscape, 3 different, you can say, groups of stakeholders. Now see there how they've got different ways they're valuing nature, different forms of knowledge that they see as the best knowledge, and then also different ways they engage with rules. And this will influence also how you engage with those people, what's important for them, how you communicate with them. So, for example, it's not going to help you to engage with the utility group and you're using this relational values language when they're actually centered around instrumental values. Or the same with the bottom-up conservation people. If you're coming with them with these very formal contracts, kind of agreements, things, and they're actually more aligned with these informal kind of agreements, let's become friends and then collaborate together. So this is just to emphasize again how we need to start rethinking how we engage with stewardship, how we frame with stewardship, and working with different people. Now I'm taking it a little bit a level up to show just some examples of how how value is being measured at the international level for biodiversity and conservation and restoration is changing. This is an example from the Science and Policy, the IPBS, which has developed what they call a plural valuation method of valuing nature-based ecosystem services. And there you can see they're trying to align relational values and instrumental values in the kind of projects that they get involved in. This is just an example of how that fits into an evaluation framework. The Society of Ecological Restoration is also looking at these kind of aspects. This is their version of what they call the social benefits wheel, which is intended to be used with I think they call the ecological benefit wheel, as an example. And then very recently, as part of, you've probably heard of the sustainable development goals, there are now inner development goals as well. And look at all the words there that have also been mentioned frequently today. So this is more just to emphasize and make you aware that there's some kind of shift happening in how we think about values and how we frame about values, not only in these kind of personal spaces, in the research space, on the ground spaces, it's actually happening quite high up. So also from a very pragmatic point of view, we may start seeing this kind of language creep into grant applications, other kind of funding sources, or when you engage with a funder, they may start asking these things as well. Which is interesting because it means that maybe there's a little bit of a space now opening up to actually talk about these different kind of values and not just the typical ones. Now, just for fun, I did a little bit of a look into the literature so what's the status of literature on relational values and these kind of terms within the Thicket bio. Because I was actually quite surprised. What really struck me the last time we had this the Thicket forum last year, and people mentioned how Thicket seems to have this branding problem. So this was a very quick and dirty literature review. This is not on a scientific publishing level at all, but just to check what is the status. I did a very quick word search of those terms in Scopus data space combined with Thicket biome or Thicket or Fynbos Cape floristic region or Res Nostreveld. That's the number of studies I've found. There's almost nothing at the moment out there on this value space, and yet we all know intuitively here that this is a very important area of Thicket valuation. What I do want to highlight here is that there are actually several studies now published regarding Thicket and the Thicket biome in terms of bioculture, which is basically the idea of the link between cultural diversity and biological diversity, and how these two actually engage and interact with each other. And it can be quite enriching and meaningful for people. And this is one book that at least has been published. Most of those case studies are to do with the Xhosa people. And it's very interesting things that come out there, because this doesn't just document how this cultural group, of course they're like cultural practices involving nature or indigenous knowledge or medicinal plants. It actually goes a lot deeper into this, how people in this time are still using features of nature or natural landscapes as quite an important source for social support, emotional support, spiritual support, to deal with sometimes very difficult life experiences. So this is just re-emphasizing that the value is there, it's not being documented, but your thicket forests, for example, play a very important role for people as a place to go for spiritual, emotional healing after traumatic experiences or very big events in their lives. So if we lose those areas, even if they don't have a lot of financial value, you actually lose quite an important source of comfort and well-being for people who live in that area. But again, it's not documented or hardly documented. So just to wrap up here is that, again, I asked this question last time as well. It's like, what do we do with this? What do we do with all this information? What do we do with all of these new concepts that are coming in? And in part, what my research is to do is looking at this use of relational values and frameworks, implementing that into the context of the nitty-gritty difficulties of actually doing projects. And just two key insights from that I want to mention for this presentation now specifically is that taking on this more, you can say, plural approach to valuation, where you're trying to consider more than one way to value a landscape or a project or a restoration project that you're doing, because it requires such a massive shift in how you perceive the world, how you think about the world, even the skills and the approaches that you need for it. It does require some kind of organizational change process. It's not as simple as just taking those frameworks that I've shown before and just having additional indicators. This is quite a big shift that needs to happen to actually do it properly. The second thing also is that and this is something that Emma also mentioned, is if you're a practitioner dealing with restoration and you need to now engage more with relational values, all these different ways of valuing nature, either because you're being pressured by your funder because that's not the thing they want, or it's from your own motivation that you know this is something important to look at. There's a huge challenge here that we're still sitting within the system that still is very much based on instrumental values. And it's not that instrumental values are not also important. We've seen this whole economic discussion now so far, or financial values. But it's trying to get these different values to play together or to reinforce and support each other. Because one challenge is, for example, with relational values, as I've mentioned, it's an emergent thing. It's relationships over a long period of time. This is not an impact you're going to see in 3 or 5 years. It's a very slow process of building up this kind of relationship and these kind of relationship values, which don't then typically fit into a normal funding period or normal project kind of work. So I do want to almost raise a little flag here that we may run into a problem here where on the one side we recognize the need to both look at these more relational values in our work and being or maybe even pressured or for self-driven to do that more, but on the other side we actually don't have the systems or the funding structures at the moment that actually allow for that to happen, because it's still very much based on the instrumental kind of values. So I just want to say that don't rush forward and just adopt this now because it looks beautiful, but it's very challenging to do in reality and in practice. And I think that is it for today. So I tried to keep it short and sweet. I hope I made that.